The morning sun filtered through the pine trees as I sipped coffee on my porch, the same porch where my grandfather used to tell me stories of how our family had protected this land for generations. 5 acres of meadow stretched before me, bordered by woodland that climbed into gentle hills containing natural springs that fed the whole valley. My modest two-bedroom house stood as it had for decades, weathered but sturdy like the family that built it. I had inherited this property from my grandfather 10 years ago. He had acquired it piece by piece over his lifetime, eventually amassing nearly 40 acres of the most beautiful land in the county. "This land will take care of you if you take care of it," he always told me. I never imagined how prophetic those words would become. The first sign of trouble appeared on a Tuesday morning. Walking the eastern boundary of my property, I spotted bright orange survey stakes with ribbons fluttering in the spring breeze. They formed a line cutting about 50 feet into what I knew was my land. I pulled one up, assuming it was a surveyor's mistake, and continued my morning walk. 3 days later, more stakes appeared, this time accompanied by a formal letter in my mailbox. "Dear property owner," it began, "this notice serves to inform you of the Pine Valley Homeowners Association jurisdiction over the property lines as indicated in the attached map." I stared at the document, confused. There was no HOA in this area. We were too far from town, too rural for such things. The map showed my property with new boundaries, significantly smaller than what my deed indicated. According to this document, nearly 15 acres of my land now belonged to something called Pine Valley Estates. I called the number on the letterhead, reaching a receptionist who seemed unsurprised by my confusion. "Someone will contact you to explain the property reassessment," she said mechanically. "The county approved these boundary adjustments last month." I drove immediately to the county recorder's office, but they were closed for a staff training day. Frustrated, I decided this was clearly an administrative error that would be easily corrected. I returned home, filed the letter in my desk drawer, and dismissed it as bureaucratic nonsense. That dismissal was my first mistake. 6 days later, the sound of heavy machinery jarred me awake at dawn. From my bedroom window, I saw the unthinkable bulldozers and excavation equipment rolling onto my eastern meadow, workers in hard hats consulting blueprints while a man in a button-down shirt directed operations. I ran outside in my pajamas, heart pounding as I approached the scene. "You are on private property," I shouted over the engine noise. "This is my land. You need to leave immediately." The man in the button-down turned to me, annoyed by the interruption. "Are you James Miller?" he asked, consulting a clipboard. "Yes, and you are trespassing on my property." He introduced himself as Tom Barnett, site manager for Pinnacle Resort Development. With practiced efficiency, he extracted a set of documents from his leather portfolio. "We have all necessary approvals for this development. The HOA greenlit this project months ago." I snatched the papers from his hand, scanning property descriptions that looked nothing like my deed. "There is no HOA here. This is my land. These boundaries are wrong." Barnett pointed to a signature at the bottom of one page. "That is the approval from the Pine Valley HOA Board President, Richard Coleman, and these are the property boundaries filed with the county last quarter." My eyes fixed on a line that stated property owner notified and consent received. This was a blatant lie. I had never given consent for anything. "This is fraudulent," I said, my voice shaking with anger. "I never approved any of this." Barnett shrugged, taking back the documents. "Look, I just managed the construction. You might want to check your deed against the county records. The HOA approved this resort development, and we are on schedule to break ground for the main building next week." As he walked away, ordering his crew back to work, my stomach dropped with the sickening realization that something was terribly wrong. This was my land that had been in my family for generations, and someone was trying to steal it right from under me. The county recorder's office opened at 8 the next morning. I was waiting at the door, clutching my original property deed and a folder of family documents. The clerk, a middle-aged woman named Patricia, recognized me from previous visits when I had filed paperwork after my grandfather passed away. "James, what brings you in so early?" she asked, gesturing for me to follow her to her desk. I explained the situation, spreading my documents across her workspace. She frowned, typing information into her computer. Let me pull up the current records for your property. What appeared on her screen made my blood run cold. The property boundaries had indeed been altered, significantly reducing my acreage. More disturbing were amendments filed just 3 months earlier, containing what appeared to be my signature authorizing the changes. This is not my signature, I said, pointing at the screen. I never signed anything like this. Patricia looked troubled. The documents were filed through proper channels, notarized and everything. She printed copies for me, showing filing dates, the notary information, and the signatures of witnesses. Who submitted these changes? I asked. She scrolled through the records. The paperwork was submitted by a legal representative for Pine Valley Estates, LLC. I spent the next 4 hours combing through property records, discovering that similar boundary adjustments had been made to several properties neighboring mine. All the changed boundaries connected, creating a continuous tract of land now apparently owned by Pine Valley Estates. On my way home, I stopped at Martha Johnson's house. Martha was in her 80s and had lived adjacent to my property for over 50 years. If anyone knew about local land matters, it would be her. Martha invited me in for tea, listening carefully as I explained what I had discovered. Her eyes narrowed as I mentioned the HOA. There was no vote, no community meeting, she said. About 6 months ago, some well-dressed men came around with papers claiming they were forming a neighborhood association to protect property values because of upcoming development in the area. They said signing would ensure we had a voice in any changes. She shook her head. Many people signed without reading the fine print, but I refused. 2 weeks later, I got a letter saying the HOA had been formed anyway, with enough signatures to proceed under state law. Martha retrieved a folder of her own, showing me the HOA formation documents. I called several neighbors after receiving this. Many claimed they never signed anything about an HOA. Armed with growing suspicion, I researched Pine Valley Estates and Pinnacle Resort Development that evening. The connection emerged quickly. Richard Coleman, the HOA president, was listed as a principal investor in Pinnacle. 2 other HOA board members had financial ties to the development company as well. That night I searched through boxes in my attic, finding yellowed survey maps and the original deed my grandfather had shown me as a child. He had been meticulous about property boundaries, having experienced a border dispute decades earlier. These documents clearly showed the true boundaries of our land, including the natural springs and watershed areas that made the property so valuable. The next morning, I consulted with a local attorney named Michael Drake, bringing all my documentation. After reviewing everything, he leaned back in his chair, expression grave. James, this is clearly fraudulent activity, but fighting it will not be easy. Pinnacle Development has deep pockets and an army of corporate lawyers. They have created a legal fiction, this HOA, to facilitate the theft of your land. He explained that challenging them would require extensive legal action, fraud complaints, property disputes, and injunctions to stop construction. And they will fight you every step of the way, dragging out proceedings until you cannot afford to continue. How much would this cost? I asked. His estimate was staggering, potentially hundreds of thousands of dollars with no guarantee of success. They are counting on you not having the resources to fight, he said. I stared at his estimated legal fees, which exceeded my annual income as a graphic designer working remotely. My savings would be depleted within months. What if I just go to the police? This is fraud, possibly forgery. Michael shook his head. The police will call it a civil matter. These companies operate in legal gray areas. They have created enough paperwork to make it look legitimate to authorities. I drove home in a daze, watching excavators tear into my meadow as I passed. The scope of the conspiracy was becoming clear. This was not just about my land, but about water rights, development permits, and millions in potential profit. These people had orchestrated an elaborate scam, and I was now in a fight for my family legacy against opponents with seemingly unlimited resources. I decided to fight through official channels first, believing that once authorities saw the evidence, they would halt the construction. I filed complaints with the county commissioner's office, the building permit department, and the Environmental Protection Agency. Each time, I was met with polite acknowledgments and promises to look into the matter. Days passed, the construction continued unabated. Bulldozers cleared land, trees were felled, and foundation work began for what the site plans called the main lodge. Each morning brought more dester. Auction to land my family had preserved for generations. My follow-up calls to government offices yielded little progress. These matters take time to investigate, I was told repeatedly. One sympathetic clerk at the permit office whispered that Pinnacle Development had friends in high places and suggested I would need substantial evidence to overcome their influence. Through persistent demands, I finally secured a spot on the agenda for the next HOA board meeting. I prepared meticulously, organizing my evidence into a clear presentation that would expose the fraud to other homeowners. Surely once the community understood what was happening, they would stand with me. The meeting was held in a rented conference room at a local hotel. Upon arrival, I discovered the room packed with unfamiliar faces, people I had never seen in our rural community. Richard Coleman presided at the front table, flanked by 4 board members. He was tall and distinguished, with silver hair and an expensive suit that screamed success and authority. When my turn to speak came, I approached the podium with my folder of evidence. "My name is James Miller. My family has owned our property for 3 generations," I began, proceeding to outline the fraudulent boundary changes and questionable HOA formation. Coleman interrupted before I could finish. "Mr. Miller, we are all familiar with your complaints. The property boundaries were legally adjusted through proper channels with all appropriate notifications." I held up my original deed. "These documents prove the true boundaries of my property. The signatures on your paperwork are forgeries." Coleman's expression hardened. "Are you accusing this board of criminal behavior? These are serious allegations with no substantive evidence." I tried to continue, but Coleman spoke over me. "Mr. Miller appears to be having difficulty accepting the legitimate development in our community. Perhaps his attachment to family land has clouded his understanding of legal property matters." Murmurs spread through the audience as Coleman signaled to a security guard. "We appreciate your concerns, but this meeting has a full agenda. If you have legal disputes, the courts are the appropriate venue, not this forum." The security guard approached, making it clear my time was up. As I gathered my documents, Coleman added loudly, "I would suggest consulting with mental health services. Acceptance of change can be difficult for some." Laughter rippled through the room as I was essentially escorted out. My face burned with humiliation and rage. In the parking lot, I leaned against my truck, struggling to compose myself. An older man approached cautiously. "I am Robert Chen," he introduced himself. "I live on Oak Ridge Road. You are not alone in this fight." Over the next hour in a nearby diner, I met 5 other property owners who shared similar stories. Their land boundaries had been altered, HOA fees imposed without consent, and threats made when they questioned the changes. Robert had lost 3 acres to the development. Another neighbor, Susan, had received code violation notices immediately after questioning the HOA's authority. "They are using intimidation tactics," Robert explained. "Several people who initially resisted suddenly changed their minds after financial pressures appeared. Mortgage rates mysteriously increased, insurance policies canceled, building permits denied for simple home improvements." This small group of resistors shared information that painted a more extensive picture of corruption. The development was not just a resort, but a massive complex including a golf course, luxury condominiums, and a shopping center, all built on land taken from existing residents through manipulated documents and regulatory capture. Most disturbingly, I obtained copies of the master plans through Robert, who had a contact in the planning department. These revealed that the resort's main attractions would be built directly over protected wetlands on my property, wetlands fed by the natural springs that had been part of our land for generations. The environmental impact alone should be enough to stop this, Susan said. But they have somehow fast-tracked all the permits, bypassing standard environmental reviews. In the days that followed, I began meticulously documenting everything. I took date-stamped photos of the construction, recorded conversations when legal, and marked true boundary lines with stakes that mysteriously disappeared overnight. I created a detailed log of environmental violations, sediment runoff into streams, protected trees removed without permits, construction waste improperly disposed of near water sources. The construction crews worked at an aggressive pace, clearly racing to create a situation too expensive to reverse. Richard Coleman occasionally appeared at the site, surveying progress with satisfaction, making a point of smiling coldly in my direction when He noticed me documenting their activities from my property line. My resistance had begun, but I was painfully aware that time was not on my side. Each day brought more destruction, more concrete poured, more trees felled. The David versus Goliath nature of the fight was becoming increasingly apparent, and I needed something more than slingshots to take down this corporate giant. 6 weeks into my battle, we had our first court hearing for a preliminary injunction to halt construction. My attorney Michael had filed emergency motions, citing irreparable environmental damage and property rights violations. Our evidence was substantial original deeds, forged documents, environmental impact studies commissioned at my expense, and testimonies from neighbors about the fraudulent HOA formation. Judge Reynolds presided, a stern woman with reading glasses perched on her nose as she reviewed our filings. Pinnacle Development had sent 3 attorneys in expensive suits, led by a sharp-tongued litigator named Victor Harmon. He presented counter-evidence suggesting all proper procedures had been followed, producing notarized documents and permits signed by county officials. Your Honor, Harmon argued smoothly, Mr. Miller is understandably emotional about changes to family property, but progress cannot be halted based on sentimentality. Pinnacle has invested millions based on properly obtained approvals. An injunction would cause irreparable financial harm to my client and the economic development of this region. When the judge rendered her decision, the courtroom fell silent. While Mr. Miller raises concerning issues that merit further examination, I cannot find sufficient evidence of irreparable harm to warrant a preliminary injunction. Construction may continue while the court examines the underlying property disputes. Michael placed a steadying hand on my arm as I slumped in my chair. Outside the courtroom, Harmon approached with artificial sympathy. Mr. Miller, Pinnacle would be willing to discuss a generous settlement for any inconvenience. This litigation will be costly for you, with little chance of success. I walked away without responding, but his words echoed in my mind as I drove home. The financial reality was becoming dire. My savings account was draining rapidly from legal fees. I had taken unpaid leave from work to fight this battle, and my boss was losing patience with my extended absence. The stress manifested physically. I lost weight, developed persistent headaches, and spent nights staring at my ceiling instead of sleeping. Dark circles formed under my eyes, visible whenever I caught my reflection. Construction not only continued but accelerated. Crews now worked around the clock, floodlights illuminating the site through the night. The constant noise of machinery made rest impossible. More devastating was the damage to the watershed on my property. The excavation altered natural drainage patterns, causing flooding during heavy rains that seeped into my basement, damaging family heirlooms and photographs. I cataloged each new violation, filing complaints that disappeared into bureaucratic black holes. One sympathetic inspector admitted privately that his hands were tied. "Orders from above," he muttered, refusing to meet my eyes. The final blow came when Michael called with disturbing news. A whistleblower from the county planning office had contacted him with evidence that 3 county officials had received consulting fees from Pinnacle Development. These payments coincided with expedited permits and overlooked environmental violations. "This is criminal," I said, hope rising that we finally had leverage. Michael tempered my expectations. "It is criminal, but proving it in court will be another costly battle. The whistleblower will not testify publicly for fear of retaliation. Without their testimony, we have circumstantial evidence at best. That evening, I stood on my porch watching floodlights illuminate what was once my peaceful meadow. Construction equipment stood like mechanical beasts feeding on the land. The springs that my grandfather had shown me as a child were now diverted through plastic pipes to make way for building foundations. For the first time, I considered surrendering. The physical, emotional, and financial toll had become unbearable. Pinnacle had deeper pockets, political connections, and time on their side. Perhaps taking a settlement would at least allow me to keep my house and a small portion of land. With a heavy heart, I called Michael. My voice broke as I asked him to inquire about settlement terms. "I cannot keep fighting like this," I admitted. "They have won through attrition." There was a long pause on the line. "James, before you make that decision, there is something you should know." I consulted with a colleague who specializes in water rights law. She noticed something in your grandfather's original deed that might change everything. "Hi." S words barely registered through my exhaustion. What difference would it make now? They have the construction permits, the political connections, everything. "Not everything," Michael replied, excitement growing in his voice. "Have you ever heard of riparian water rights? Because according to these documents, you might control the one thing their resort absolutely cannot function without." The following morning, I met Michael at his office, joined by his colleague Sofia Martinez, a specialist in environmental and water rights law. She spread my grandfather's original documents across the conference table, pointing to specific clauses highlighted in yellow. "Your grandfather was remarkably forward-thinking," Sophia explained. "These provisions explicitly preserve all riparian and underground water rights associated with the property, specifically the natural springs and underground aquifers." Michael added, "In our state, historical water rights supersede modern property disputes. Even if they take your land, which we are not conceding, they cannot legally divert or use these water sources without proper permits." Sophia turned her laptop to show me the resort plans we had obtained. "Look at their design. The entire concept revolves around water features decorative lakes, flowing streams between buildings, a high-end spa utilizing natural spring water as their marketing centerpiece." "And those permits would require my signature?" I asked, beginning to understand. "Exactly," she confirmed. "They can build on the land, but without access to these water sources, their resort becomes an empty shell. Based on their engineering plans, they have designed everything assuming unrestricted access to your water rights, which they do not legally have." For the first time in weeks, I felt a flicker of hope. So we pivot from fighting the land grab directly to challenging their water usage. Both attorneys nodded. "It gives us leverage they did not anticipate," Michael said. "We need to document these water sources immediately." We hired an independent hydrologist named Dr. Emily Wung to survey my property. Her findings exceeded our expectations. The natural springs on my land were not just features, but the primary source feeding the entire watershed for the region. Her report confirmed that the resort's design would require approximately 30,000 gallons daily from these sources usage that would require specialized permits under state law. Without these water sources, Dr. Wung explained, they would need to truck in water at enormous expense or drill deep wells that would likely require environmental impact studies and face significant opposition from conservation groups. This revelation changed my entire approach. Rather than fighting a losing battle over property lines, I could leverage what they desperately needed. Sophia drafted legal notices informing Pinnacle Development of my intent to protect my water rights, including cease and desist orders against any diversion of springs or groundwater. Simultaneously, I connected with the River Valley Conservation Alliance, an environmental group that had been monitoring development in the region. Their director, Angela Torres, had been seeking ways to challenge Pinnacle's project due to concerns about watershed damage. "Your water rights case gives us the legal standing we have been looking for," Angela explained during our meeting. "We have scientists who can testify about the ecological importance of these springs and the potential environmental damage from their development plans." The alliance provided resources I desperately needed: legal support, scientific expertise, and crucially, media connections. Local newspapers began running stories about permit irregularities and environmental concerns. A regional TV station sent reporters to film construction activities encroaching on protected wetland areas. As public attention grew, I received an unexpected call from Thomas Blackwood, CEO of Meridian Hospitality Group, a competitor to Pinnacle Development. He requested a private meeting at his office in the city. "I have been following your situation with interest," Blackwood said after pleasantries. "Pinnacle's methods have made them enemies throughout the industry. Their cut corners eventually collapse." He proposed a strategic partnership. Meridian would provide financial backing for my legal battle in exchange for future development considerations should I prevail. "We build sustainable properties that work with natural environments rather than destroying them," he explained, showing me portfolios of their eco-friendly resorts. This partnership solved my most pressing problem: financial resources to sustain the legal fight. With Meridian's backing, we hired additional experts and expanded our legal team. Our strategy crystallized into 3 coordinated efforts: legal challenges to water usage rights, environmental regulatory complaint, and a public relations campaign highlighting Pinnacle's corrupt practices. I no longer felt alone in the fight. Each morning, I would walk my property line, documenting new construction while Dr. Wang's team monitored water quality and flow rates from the springs. Environmental activists sometimes joined me, collecting their own evidence for regulatory complaints. Richard Coleman and his Pinnacle executives noticed the shift. Construction supervisors received instructions to avoid any activities near the springs or water features. Surveyors appeared, reassessing the hydrology of the site with worried expressions. For the first time since bulldozers appeared on my land, I sensed uncertainty in their operations. Our strategy was working, not by confronting their land grab directly, but by controlling something they could not simply take through manipulated paperwork: the water that made their entire project viable. The balance of power had subtly shifted. I was no longer just fighting to keep what was mine. I was positioning myself to potentially gain much more. The scammers who thought they had engineered the perfect land grab had overlooked the most valuable resource flowing beneath the surface. Our counterattack began with precision legal filings focused on water rights, environmental compliance, and permitting fraud. Sophia and Michael coordinated with Meridian's legal team to create a multi-pronged approach that would pressure Pinnacle from multiple directions simultaneously. The first victory came swiftly. A district environmental judge issued a temporary restraining order prohibiting any diversion of water from the natural springs pending a full environmental review. Construction crews, already pouring foundations for the main resort building, suddenly found themselves unable to proceed with plumbing and water feature installations. Richard Coleman personally appeared at the construction site the following day, visibly agitated, as he consulted with engineers about alternative water sources. The options were all problematic: drilling deep wells would require new permits and environmental studies that could take months. Trucking in water would be prohibitively expensive for a resort of this scale. Our media campaign gained traction when drone footage captured construction waste being dumped near protected wetland areas. The footage, provided anonymously to local news stations, prompted an investigation by state environmental regulators who had previously ignored our complaints. Inspectors now swarmed the site, issuing violations and substantial fines. "This is just a temporary setback," Coleman told reporters confidently. "Pine Valley Resort will proceed as planned." Behind his public statements, however, Pinnacle Development faced growing problems. Construction delays triggered penalty clauses with contractors. Environmental fines accumulated daily. Investors began asking uncomfortable questions about project viability. The pressure intensified when 3 HOA board members abruptly resigned after evidence emerged connecting them financially to Pinnacle Development. Anonymous tips to the district attorney's office, carefully orchestrated by our legal team, prompted a preliminary investigation into financial kickbacks and improper permit approvals. County officials who had expedited Pinnacle's permits now faced scrutiny about their relationships with developers. One commissioner recused himself from all matters related to the project. Another took an unexpected medical leave. The whistleblower from the planning department, now protected by attorneys from Meridian, provided documents showing irregular approval processes for Pinnacle's permits. As Pinnacle's position weakened, I authorized my legal team to present settlement terms. Our offer would allow a modified development with proper compensation for my land, restoration of damaged watershed areas, and strict environmental protections for the springs and wetlands. Richard Coleman requested a face-to-face meeting to discuss these terms. We met at my attorney's office, Coleman arriving with Victor Harmon and two executives from Pinnacle. The arrogance that had defined his previous interactions was tempered but still present. "Your tactics have caused unnecessary delays to an important economic development project," Coleman began, adjusting his expensive cufflinks. "However, in the interest of moving forward, we are prepared to offer compensation for water access rights." I listened as he outlined their counterproposal, a fraction of what my land was worth, with vague promises about environmental considerations. When he finished, I simply slid our original settlement document back across the table. "These are our terms, they are non-negotiable." Coleman's face flushed. "You overestimate your position, Mr. Miller. We have invested millions in this development. The county supports this project for its economic benefits, one way or another. This resort will be built." "Not without water," I replied calmly, "and not without addressing the fraudulent means through which you acquired land rights." Coleman stood abruptly. "We will see you in court. Pinnacle has never lost a development dispute, and we will not start now." As they departed, Michael exchanged a knowing look with me. Coleman's rejection of reasonable terms would only strengthen our position if the case proceeded to trial. More importantly, his dismissive attitude toward environmental concerns would soon prove catastrophic. 2 weeks later, spring rains arrived early and with unusual intensity. The partially constructed resort, with foundations laid but drainage systems incomplete, faced exactly the water management issues our hydrologist had predicted. Retaining walls collapsed under pressure from underground springs seeking their natural paths. Construction equipment sank into mud as improperly compacted soil liquefied. The damage was catastrophic and highly visible. Local news helicopters captured footage of flooded excavations and collapsing structures. Engineers assessed the damage at several $1 million, with weeks of work lost. Most damaging to Pinnacle, their insurance company denied coverage for much of the destruction, citing the construction company's failure to address documented environmental concerns about the watershed and spring activity. Internal emails obtained through discovery revealed that Pinnacle executives had dismissed hydrologists' warnings about building in this location without proper water management systems. As Pinnacle's stock price plummeted on news of the construction disaster, investors demanded emergency board meetings. Development stalled completely as contractors refused to proceed without additional payment guarantees. Richard Coleman made a final defiant press statement blaming sabotage and environmental extremists for the project's troubles. The desperation in his voice was evident to everyone watching. His company faced financial ruin, criminal investigations, and a project that literally could not proceed without my cooperation. The tables had completely turned. Now I held all the leverage, and the scammers who had tried to steal my family legacy were the ones facing devastation. 6 months after bulldozers first appeared on my land, I sat across from Pinnacle Development's board of directors in their corporate headquarters. Richard Coleman was noticeably absent, having been placed on administrative leave pending multiple investigations. The mood was somber as their chief financial officer outlined their position. "Pinnacle Development has invested $43 million in the Pine Valley Resort project to date," he explained. "Our investors are understandably concerned about the construction delays and regulatory issues." What followed was their attempt at damage control, an improved offer for my land and water rights, still substantially below market value, with conditions releasing them from liability for environmental damage. I let them finish before nodding to my attorney. Michael slid our proposal across the polished conference table. These are our settlement terms. They are not subject to negotiation. The terms were extraordinarily favorable to me. Full ownership transfer of the incomplete resort and all associated permits, substantial damages for the trauma and property destruction, and a complete release of any claims against me or other affected property owners. "This is completely unreasonable," the CFO sputtered. "You want us to simply give you a $43 million investment." Sophia Martinez, my water rights attorney, spoke clearly. "What you have is a partially built resort with no viable water supply, constructed on fraudulently obtained land, facing criminal investigations and environmental sanctions. Your company is hemorrhaging investor confidence daily. This offer allows Pinnacle to exit a catastrophic situation without bankruptcy or further criminal exposure." After 2 hours of heated discussion, the board requested time for private deliberation. 3 days later, they accepted our terms with minor modifications. Pinnacle Development's board believed they were offloading a failed project to a naive landowner who did not understand the financial impossibility of completing the resort. What they failed to recognize was that throughout the legal battle, I had been working closely with Thomas Blackwood and Meridian Hospitality Group. The settlement transferred all construction permits and development rights to a new entity, Springwater Resort, and Preserve LLC with me as the majority shareholder and Meridian as the operating partner. With Pinnacle out of the picture, we completely reimagined the resort. Rather than fighting the natural hydrology, our design embraced it. The springs became the centerpiece of the property, protected by conservation easements while providing sustainable water for carefully designed amenities. Environmental engineers reworked the half-built structures to create the first truly sustainable luxury destination in the region. Solar arrays replaced planned diesel generators. Green roofs and rainwater collection systems minimized environmental impact. The former wetlands were restored and enhanced, becoming signature features rather than obstacles to overcome. The Pine Valley HOA dissolved amid ongoing legal proceedings, replaced by a transparent community association that included all original property owners as stakeholders in the resort's success. Neighbors who had once feared the development now received regular dividends from its operation. Richard Coleman and 2 other Pinnacle executives eventually faced federal charges for fraud and environmental violations. The county officials who had facilitated their scheme were removed from office, some facing their own legal troubles. Construction resumed with proper permits and community input. Local contractors received preference for jobs, creating economic benefits that extended throughout the region. What had begun as a devastating land grab transformed into a billion-dollar enterprise with benefits shared throughout the community. 3 years after that first terrible morning when I discovered construction on my land, I stood on the observation deck of Springwater Resort and Preserve's Grand Lodge. Below me, guests enjoyed the natural beauty my family had protected for generations, now preserved through conservation easements that would prevent any future development or exploitation. The springs my grandfather had shown me as a child now flowed through beautifully designed channels, their clean, clear water a testament to responsible environmental stewardship. The resort had already received international recognition for its sustainable design and operations, with bookings solid for 2 years ahead. Thomas Blackwood joined me on the deck, handing me a glass of champagne. "Your grandfather would be proud," he said, gesturing toward the preserved meadows and forests. "You protected his legacy and transformed it into something remarkable." I nodded, thinking of the journey from that moment of devastation to this triumph. He always said the land would take care of me if I took care of it. I never imagined how right he would be. What began as theft had become the foundation of an empire, my empire, built on respect for the land and its resources rather than exploitation. The springs that Pinnacle had seen as merely features to commercialize had become the source of not just water, but unprecedented prosperity that would benefit my family for generations to come.